as you can tell, we're recording. I'm Tammi Jonas, the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. And for those who haven't caught up with one of our solidarity sessions before, I'd just say we have a YouTube channel where they've all been recorded and stored. And I recommend that you go and have a look, because there might be other ones of interest to you. We had an interesting one on learning from Indigenous knowledges with Tyson Yunkaporta some months ago. And I think you'd get a lot out of that one as well. Anyway, I'll leave it to you to have a look. Tonight, though, I'd also invite you to keep your cameras on if you have bandwidth for it. I totally understand not everybody does. I also understand sometimes you're not in suitable attire to have your camera on, and in which case I recommend keeping it off. If you want to ask a question later on, we would prefer that you do that by with your camera and talk in person so we can see each other. It's a nicer experience for everybody. But again, if bandwidth or any other reason precludes you from doing that, by all means, put questions in the chat. Tonight's session is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing from Murray Pryor tonight from Nguuruu. I can't say it properly, but he's going to show you how to properly. Georgie's laughing because she can say it better than me now. And Georgie's going to be asking Murray for his insights into how he's working on collaborating on country with his local mob. Paul's not here with us tonight, but I think they'll talk to that a bit more in a moment. And I just want to start this conversation by asking Georgie something. I think in our movement, we're increasingly asking farmers who are farming unceded lands to come to terms with what that means, what we can do to try to ensure a return to Indigenous sovereignty, and how we're enacting our custodial ethic on our land, or if we are at all. And so I wanted to start, though, because I think that question applies to everyone. Every non-Indigenous person in Australia has to come to terms with our relations with land and with the original owners. And so I'm going to throw it to Georgie and ask, in your journey of trying to decolonize your mind and your solidarity, how have you been trying to enact a custodial ethic in a colonized cityscape, in your case?
Great, thanks, Tammi. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining from tonight, which is the Gadigal and the Bidjigal people. And I want to pay my respect to elders past and present. So yeah, thanks so much for the question, Tammi, to get us started. And I think also to really ensure that this conversation is to all our members and to people in Australia who are living on unceded land. I think for me, this is obviously a huge journey to go on. And I reflect that I've been living on the land of the Gadigal and more specifically the Bidjigal people for about 18 months now. And the majority of that has been in the pandemic. And I think a silver lining of that has been a huge presence and growing connection to the place that we find ourselves in, especially when we're so confined to a small geographical area. And so I think for me, the custodial ethic that I am trying to establish is really one of awareness and presence in the landscape. And I think understanding the changing of the seasons, whether or not that's the migration of Girrawah, which are the whales that migrate up and down the coast, or the migration of yellow-tailed black cockatoos, and the flowering of different plants. And I think, observing that change throughout the season and understanding and beginning to even contemplate what the significance of that is to First Nations people is, one of the very early steps that I'm taking. I think sort of secondly, really try and connect with the Bidjigal people from this area and support their enterprises. There's an incredible nursery down in La Perouse, which is involved in the conservation of the eastern suburbs Banksia scrub and propagating a lot of native plants from Kamei National Park and then selling those in their nursery that they have down in La Cruz. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to visit there earlier this year and be able to support them and to be able to grow some of those plants, even living in an apartment. And I think sort of moving forward, something that I really want to explore is understanding language and, you know, really learning about the Sydney language or what's now commonly referred to as Darug, to really, you know, bring that, you know, I guess grounding back into the First Nations people that, you know, have always been present here. But they're, you know, it's definitely a very early stage in this journey, and, you know, I think it's about chipping away at it and trying to always listen and be present. Cool. Well, I think, do you want me to kick off now? Cool. Okay, well, so thanks, Tammi, as well for the introduction. And I want to welcome Murray Pryor here, who I'm going to be chatting with tonight. And then we will be opening it up to questions a bit later on as well. So Murray is joining us from Nguuruu Farm down in Ngambri on the southern tablelands of New South Wales, where he's got a diversified operation of including, you know, belted Girrawah, fruit, vegetables, and some chicken and eggs. But more specifically here tonight, we want to talk about the partnership that Murray has established with Paul House, Girrawah, who is a Ngambri, Walgalu, Wallabalooa, and Wiradjuri man. And so we're really here. I'm really excited to be able to, you know, facilitate this conversation to understand how you've been collaborating on country and, you know, what your hopes and visions are for that moving forward. Before we sort of get into that, I just wanted to sort of, I guess, position this conversation and I guess hear from Murray, you know, why you think that it's important that us predominantly as white folk and settlers are having these conversations, and sometimes why that doesn't necessarily need to be here with Paul, even though he was, of course, most invited to be part of this conversation.
Well, thank you, Georgie, and thank you for the warm welcome, and hello, everybody. I can see a few very familiar friends and faces there, so I feel like I'm in everyone's lounge room. Yeah, today is a chat about all of these big things, and to get into it, I think it's important for us as settlers to be talking about these things, because, as Paul would say, our mob's tired of talking about this stuff and trying to convince the rest of Australia of the truth telling. It's time for white people, settlers, to step up to the plate and demonstrate a bit of leadership. And that's the words from Paul's mouth, and that's the message that he wanted me to convey to all of you. So I'm humbly doing my best here to just share my story. It's a warts and all story. Forgive me if I come across at times a little passionate. I make no apologies for my own personal journey, and nor do I make apologies for some of the views that I have in relation to what needs to be done. But I think it's a really positive thing to be focused on, because it's really the unfinished business of this nation. And we really ought to be, all of us really ought to be leaning in on how we address these wrongs.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. I think I couldn't agree more. Then talk, you know, starting with the warts and all, maybe we can rewind a little bit to before you were on Nguuruu and, you know, beginning your regenerative farming journey. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, you know, where you come from physically and you know, where your thinking and mindset have come from, and before you start, at the beginning of this farming journey.
Okay. So I was born and bred in Canberra. So I'm on Ngunnawal Ngambri country here today, and I was born into a lower middle class family where my father was a career policeman and my mum was a stay-at-home childcare worker. And in some ways, it was a fairly traditional and ordinary kind of childhood. Nothing particularly significant in it, except that I lived my life through the prism of community policing as it dealt with the justice system in Australia. And my entire childhood was formed by the views of my father in relation to the issues of crime. And I got to say, it was a racist family. We were part of a system, part of a widespread culture of racism towards, a lot of people from different backgrounds, but in particular to Indigenous people. And I'm not proud of that. But what I would also say is that as a child, I knew no better. And this is a really important point that I want to get across, is that there's a cycle going on here where children are brought up in families like this that have these views, and then it tends to unfortunately get repeated through the generations. I'll come back on to the topic of breaking that cycle, but I just wanted to be kind of transparent with everybody that, I wasn't born to be enlightened like this. It's been a slow and painful journey for me in terms of discovering all of these things about what I was a part of and what I believed. So moving forward from that, I met my wife who comes from a European background, and she's been probably one of the biggest influences on me because as a European Australian, she comes from a minority group, and so has not only the female nurturing attribute, but she also has this affinity with minority groups. And her kind of guidance in our marriage along the way, and she would say it's been too slow, and but nevertheless I'm getting there. She's been quite a big influence on me in terms of switching a few lights on. Moving forward to how this all kind of a few threads came together. We wanted to go farming. I've got a busy corporate job. I spend a lot of time up until recently overseas. A lot of that time has been in hotel rooms in cities far away by myself, family back here in Australia. And, really thinking, is this all that I am supposed to be doing on this planet? So one thing kind of led to another. I'm cutting a very long story short, but that sort of urge to want to do more than the sort of corporate life led us towards this sort of farming caper. And we purchased the farm, and a good friend of mine gave me the book, which I had no knowledge of at the time, the Call of the Reed Warbler, Charlie Massey. And he said, oh, now that you've gone and done a very silly thing of buying a farm, you probably should read this book. And of course, when I read the book, it had a lot of things in it which were counter to what I thought I would be doing. And so that was kind of one of the key moments where I started, I guess, this sort of regenerative journey in a practical sense. Moving from there, we had the good fortune of having Charlie help us with developing the farm in the early days, and spending some time with Charlie, really thinking about stewardship. And, I think, he was quite at pains to sort of impress upon me this idea that I didn't own the place, and that I was kind of, essentially passing through. And that was kind of a moment where I thought, all right, well, if that's the case, then what are the sorts of things that I need to be able to regenerate the land and regenerate myself? And that kind of led us towards this idea that if it's taken 200 years for settlers to essentially stuff the place up, then it's a little arrogant to think that we have all of the answers in relation to how to fix it. And so I really wanted to explore, principally to begin with, this idea of having Indigenous help in a practical sense. That, of course, led to a much deeper and much more profound life journey, if you like, because the assistance and the guidance that we've really received has been much more on, resetting ourselves as human beings. And I can talk more about that as we go through today. So that's kind of, I guess, the background to how I kind of came to this point of, growing up as a child, moving through a corporate life, finding that was a fairly unfulfilling experience as a total human, and then going on this sort of search for sort of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think really important to, highlight, where you've come from, because I'm sure there's lots of similar histories of people in the audience tonight. And so then, I guess, fast forwarding a little bit more, how did you initially come to meet Paul, and what was involved in some of those initial conversations?
Yeah, okay. So I guess one of the things that I have discovered in the journey to engage Indigenous people, particularly in the areas of the east coast of Australia, which were more impacted, I guess, by white contact, is that it's a fairly fragmented landscape for Indigenous people. There's a lot of dislocation and disconnection. There's not clear pathways. There's not organised structures to enable me to do this easily. So it was a case of persisting, working through the elders within the Aboriginal Land Council to find the family groups and to basically engage in a discussion about what I wanted to do. And of course, I was met with all of the suspicion that comes with, someone who looks like me wanting to engage First Nations people on topics like this. So it was a long process. I met Paul. Paul had the good heart to listen and to be inquisitive and wanted to learn more. He came out to the farm. I'll never forget the day. He came out. We went around, and it was just an incredibly profound experience for me to be with him on his ancestral lands. This particular part of his ancestral lands has great meaning to him and his family. And for him to be able to have access to that and to be able to move on country, was really moving. And, there were tears shed, and it was a pretty emotional time. He did say to me, he said, you're lucky. And I said, what do you mean lucky? And he said, you've got all of this. You need to look after it for all of us. And I remember coming back to the house and saying to my wife, you know, this is what Paul said, and what I think he means is that this land is locked up, and this farm needs to be looked after, needs to be protected, but because of the colonial structures we have, he's essentially saying, well, you need to look after it for all of us. And I said to my wife, there's something not right about that. And that kind of led to a whole bunch of deeper engagement with Paul, which obviously has led to other things. But that was kind of, I guess, the early days of my relationship with Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. There's a incredible post on Murray's Instagram where he shares his story, and I've probably not been so moved on Instagram as I have when I read that post, so I can't really imagine what it was like to be there that day. So the partnership that you and Paul eventually got to is governed under Wiradjuri law, and it's called Ngunnawal. Can you explain to us what constitutes this partnership and what your responsibilities, especially as a white person, are in that agreement?
Yeah, so I guess as Paul and I talked about this idea of land sharing, you know, it brings up all of the thoughts, all of the prejudices, all of the fears that people have, that I had in relation to what might happen. And of course, your mind goes to, well, how do I protect myself? How do I set up an agreement in such a way as that I can't lose? And it's kind of, it just struck me straight away as I thought about that I hold all of the cards. I have all of the power under the law in this relationship. And so documenting that under Australian law in some form of simple contract just feels like I'm replicating the same problem over and over again. So I said to Paul, you know, I'm prepared to take the leap of faith. My family's prepared to take the leap of faith here. Is there some mechanism in your culture that we can do this agreement under? And that's where he chose this idea of Ngunnawal, which is this idea of respect for all living things. And it's a very concept, and there's a lot to it. But in layman's terms, the best analogy that I can give you is that it's like the old-fashioned, my handshake is as good as a contract. So my responsibilities under that are to uphold everything that I have said to him that we're going to be doing, and the same from him to me. So we have committed to give a piece of land to him to develop how he wants. He can do that however he wants. He can do it under whatever time frame he wants. And he can do it with his family. And the Ngunnawal part of that is the respect for that's what we've agreed, and so that's what shall happen.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting, and I think so important, as you say, to not, you know, perpetuate that recolonization through using, you know, white man's law. You speak of, you know, Paul in this partnership, you know, being given this sort of parcel of land, but, you know, from speaking to you and looking through a lot of your posts, it's really evident that the influence of Indigenous knowledge and thinking, you know, goes well beyond just, you know, one parcel of land on your property. And, you know, this year I've, as a lot of you would know, Dr. Miriam Rose Ngambri is the Senior Australian of the Year, and a concept and a word and a spiritual practice that she is famous for is Dadidi in the Nguuruu language, which is a concept called deep listening. In Wiradjuri, that's Winanja Durinya as well. And I wanted you maybe to tell us a bit about, the spiritual journey in a non-religious sense that you've been on at Nguuruu, and how, Paul has influenced that journey.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And it's one that kind of took us by surprise. It's not something that we sort of started out expecting, as I said before, but it's probably turned out to be the bigger part of the relationship. When Paul turned up to our place, we have a driveway which is about, 200 metres long, and you can kind of see the front gate from the house. And when he pulled up, he opened the gate, drove through, closed the gate, but instead of getting back in the car, he went and took a branch of eucalypt off one of the trees. And I watched him, and he puts the eucalypt under his arms and then brushes it on the ground, and then does the same in reverse, where he sweeps the ground and then puts the eucalypt under his arm. And I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, look, it's just a little ritual that I have where I'm announcing myself to country and to our ancestors. And in return, I'm putting myself on the ground, and I'm putting the ground on myself. And essentially I'm asking for good passage on country from my ancestors." And he said, "My ancestors are all around here. The trees and the birds and the animals, they are all my people. And so I do this because I'm communicating with them." And, if you let yourself go there, if you suspend your own judgments about your own beliefs, it's at a minimum, it's a beautiful thing to see and be a part of. But there is, this huge amount of connection there, both at a sort of physical sense, but also this sort of pass down of stories and pass down of knowledge. And, a lot of what Paul does when he comes here, he's seeing and touching and telling stories of things that have been passed down for forever. And so we have just found it to be the most amazing way to tune in to the landscape. When we spend time with Paul, it's like there's almost a vibration going on, because we've tuned into kind of the rhythm of the place. And I don't make apologies for talking in this kind of language, even though I'm talking to a bunch of farmers. It's more than just trying to derive an economic benefit off a landscape. If you're not in it for the whole experience, then I think you're missing out on something. And we were missing out on something until we were able to be a part of and gather some of the nuances of this sort of deep connection to country.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and as Miriam Rose talks about in Dadidi, she says that this is the gift that First Nations people can give to white people. This concept of deep listening, and I think you're as you speak there, it's really evident that that's what what is being passed through from Paul to you as well while you're on your country. Has this sort of spiritual and deep listening influence the regeneration of the landscape that you're being the custodian of?
Look, it's given us a certain sympathy for the place, which I'm not sure we would have had otherwise. Certainly as a new farmer, I didn't have a lot of the deep kind of farming background from an intergenerational farming family. That wasn't us. I didn't have seasonal knowledge. So, I was on the back foot anyway. But when we spend time with Paul, there is a transfer of sympathy, so that as we talk about things and as he points things out, and as we look to conversations about what we can do with the place, there's a lens which we look through now, which we didn't look through before, and it's a kind of like a do no harm lens. It's a way of sort of trying to pick up the heartbeat of the place, and what does it need by that sort of time on country, spending time just observing. Those things, if you make time for them, they're pretty powerful. But without Paul, we were rushing around like madmen, doing things, and we were missing a lot. So I think, we, pardon me, we haven't yet got into, practical things like cultural cool burns and other sort of practical farming methodologies, but the arrangement we have and the relationship we have has absolutely influenced the way we look at the place and the way we manage it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that reflection of time and speed is definitely something that, as white sellers, we need to constantly reflect on and think about what's driving the pace that we move at. Speaking of white people, I think, myself included, when we're trying to take meaningful action in terms of decolonizing agriculture or, our broader lives, and working towards First Nations justice, we're often sort of inhibited by this fear that we're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And instead, that just means we do nothing. And, well, we all know what happens when we do nothing. Nothing changes. So I wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about a time or two where you felt like, in hindsight, you would have gone about a conversation or an action a little bit differently, and how did you recover from this misstep to keep this partnership, moving forward? Yeah,
it's I get asked this question a bit, and there is a fair bit of fear around missteps, and particularly misspeaking. I can think of two examples I'll just share with you of words that I've chosen which haven't really resonated or gone down all that well. The first was, Paul's very keen on this idea that language should not be about us and them. He really resists the idea of talking about First Nations people as them. He would much prefer for us to be talking about our brothers and sisters, or some other form of inclusive language that doesn't pit one side against the other. So that's one thing. One thing that took me by surprise, I use a fair bit of the word mate. I use that as a term for most people, including those where I've forgotten their name. And I had called him mate once, and he said, I'd prefer, particularly if you're writing it, I'd prefer that you don't call me mate. And that took me back, because that's really, there's nothing more kind of engaging and friendly than calling somebody mate. But he said, look, in my, for a black fella, that mate feels a little bit like I'm your dog. And I said, oh, look, it's obviously not anything like what I meant. And he said, yeah, but he said, language is important. So he said, just, if you're writing stuff, I'm your best friend, I'm your fellow countryman, I'm everything except, just think about things like that which have been set up in the past, which, some of us still struggle a little bit with. So, I just being a little bit careful with words, but I must say, I wouldn't want anyone to come away from this discussion having increased their level of fear as a result of those two examples. The relationship is everything. And if you've got the intent, if it's in your heart, if you are doing it for all of the right reasons, then there is a tremendous amount of flex in relation to how things are received. So I would focus, in terms of my advice, I would say to people, focus on the relationship and the intent, and your learning will come as a result of the building of the relationship.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really powerful words and something that we, can continue to always develop. That a relationship has no end, and I think that's an important thing to remember. So can you tell us a little bit about your vision for the collaboration that you're having on country and at Nguuruu, and as well as what vision you might have for how this collaboration on country could exceed well beyond your farm gate?
Yeah, so for the farm, we are trying to feed ourselves and feed our friends and feed the local village. That's our aspiration, in that order. We have no intention of trying to be bigger or supply anybody other than that. And we are active in the idea of convincing others to turn towards more of that sort of model. And the way we kind of see that happening is through sort of a mix of, I guess, latest thinking and ancient thinking, and combining those two things. So an example of latest thinking would be where we've got some projects underway to incorporate some of the natural sequence farming, Darwin Park training stuff. Now, at one level it's pretty rudimentary stuff, but it's an example of how I think farms need to really, in the face of climate change, consider how landscapes can be more hydrated than they are. And so, adopting some of that technology, for want of a better word, is one of the priorities we have here to build some resilience into our operation. And then the ancient thinking is to make sure that for every modern idea we have, we juxtapose that against the ancient thinking, the ideas that come from First Nations people, so that there is always that mirror, and we're always testing, is this the right approach? Can it be incorporated? How do we build a model that gets the best of both worlds? So that's our vision, I guess, for the farm. In terms of the partnership with Paul, I've been encouraged by some of the early questions and encouragement that we've received in relation to what we're doing. And I've got some conversations which are running in the background, which are quite early days, but I'm where I would really like to see this is that we can somehow scale the idea of having more partnerships between settler farmers and First Australians, and in doing that, that we are able to offer some kind of a platform that facilitates relationships, facilitates First Australians businesses, enterprises, and deals First Australians into the regenerative ag space and puts them at the front of the queue in terms of the technology that we use to build our farms, but also puts them at the front of the queue in relation to the economic benefits that might come from those things. Because, I guess my wife has taught me many things, but one of them is, you need to walk a mile in other people's shoes. And, if I can leave you all with that message, if you spend time thinking about what it's like to be on the other side of the fence, to be on the wrong side of the locked farm gate, when country means so much to you, then there really is only one way to approach that problem. So I don't have the answers yet, but I am working on some kind of idea that would scale what we're doing here with Paul and make it available to others.
Yeah, super interesting. I think it'll be interesting to watch this space, but I think taking what you said earlier about the relationship being so central to it. So how do you scale and keep that relationship as being the most central thing? Interesting. You speak there of putting First Peoples at the front of the queue in terms of the thinking and the economic benefit of regenerative agriculture, and I guess I'd be curious to hear whether or not you think regenerative agriculture, as it stands, has the tools and ability to, dismantle the capitalism that is entrenched in our current food system, and whether or not it can decolonize agriculture.
Look, I think, I'm no expert, okay, so all of the people on the call here know a lot more about this than I do. I guess my humble and inexperienced opinion on this is that if you've got a mindset to care for country and to ensure that your landscape is not paying a penalty for the produce that you create from it, then you will be the type of person who is going to turn into the social issues to do with the big food system, to do with climate change and other macro issues, to, as you say, to dismantle some of the structures that we have and to allow a more community-based or democratic mechanism of creating food for everybody. I find that the conversation with you guys, those who care for country in the way that you do, is a much easier conversation than to have it with the chemical farmers, because they just haven't crossed that Rubicon. And so, my thinking here is that rather than try and boil the ocean by convincing everybody, I think it's the responsibility of those who already have the right mindset to lean in to some of these macro issues. That's just my view.
Yeah, I think that's really, sort of speaking to like a theory of change, and that you can't change everyone's mindset in an instant, but if there is sort of a ripple and outward effect from the people that have done that internal reckoning and established that custodianship, it's really powerful. But I think that is a good message for all of us here about thinking about those people that are in your communities and who you may be sharing platforms with, and sort of bringing up these conversations, because we know that these racial and social issues are just as important as the environmental ones, and are interrelated in our current food system and climate more broadly. A bit of forewarning to everyone, time to think about your questions, because I've got one last one from Murray and then we can open it up to the floor. So thinking about everything that you shared with us tonight, what is something that you would say to everyone here? What's one thing or one powerful thing that people can do tomorrow or this week to sort of start this journey, if that's where they're at, or to continue that momentum to working towards establishing a custodianship for country, and thinking about how they could connect and collaborate with the First Peoples of this country?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I wish I had a really crisp, snappy answer for you. But what Paul would say if he's sitting here next to me, he would say it's all about the extent to which white Australians can meet and form meaningful relationships with their First Australians brothers and sisters. And it's an easy thing to say, but I guess the challenge to everybody on this call is, well, how many of them do you know? How many First Australians would you be able to call as your friends? In my case, it was zero. I didn't know anybody. I certainly didn't know anyone that I could call a friend. And so my journey has been based on finding a friend and building a relationship with one and seeing where it goes. And that's really my message to all of you. If you've already got them, then nurture them and develop them. If you don't have one, go and find a friend and see where it goes.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really reinforces what you said earlier around the relationship being everything here. So I'm really happy to open it up to questions. If people either want to use the raise your hand function on Zoom, or you can just pop a little asterisk or something in the chat, and I'm happy to call your name out and you can unmute yourself. So I've got a question here from Will, if you want to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. Hey, Muzz. Lovely to be part of this, and congratulations to the Australian Food Sovereignty for putting it on. Murray, you spoke a lot about having sort of before you bought the farm and growing up in a racist family and being of a certain mindset, and the cycle of that goes through through society, and is quite evolutionary, I guess, in that perspective of the short-term society. Making this decision, obviously these connections and this decision, and now talking about it publicly, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of PR around it and so on. One of the things a lot of people may experience is being scared of what other people might think, or, you've spoken about confronting concerns, or, that element of being holding all the cards and all that sort of stuff. What has the response been from your neighbours and other people in the district and community? I think I know the answer to how you have felt about that, but I'm interested to hear what some of the thoughts have been in your immediate community.
Thanks, Wolf, and lovely to see you and your beautiful family there. Thanks for the question too. Look, we live in a regional New South Wales agricultural community, which is probably representative of the snapshot of Australia, I guess. There is a fairly close proximity to Canberra, which creates a bit of a demographic that changes things a little bit. But you know, our little village has been hugely supportive of the sorts of things we're doing, and the I guess the leadership that we're trying to demonstrate. And people are grateful for the fact that we're trying to, you know, put our head above the parapet a little bit and put this stuff out there. Equally, there are people in the district who would really prefer for this sort of stuff not to be raised. And that's because, you know, principally there's misunderstandings. There is fear, and there is also the cycle of racism as well, which is alive and well in this country, and it's evident. You don't have to go and look very far. But I do think that focusing on those who are ready to receive, those who are curious, those who in their heart think that things are that there isn't a sense of justice in all of this, or that notwithstanding that they didn't personally steal land, can accept that somebody at some point in our history stole land from people and want to be a part of some form of truth treaty telling. Those are the people who are going to take this and run with it, and put aside the fears, and you know, form these relationships and form these networks of people who can create essentially co-farm businesses. So I'm not deterred. From time to time, I'm a bit surprised and a bit disappointed, but in the large, there's more people encouraging this than are trying to throw rocks at it.
Thanks for that question and answer. I'd like to go to Libby, please. Libby, and there's two people there.
Sorry, I just had to figure out how to unmute it. Hi everyone, I'm BJ. Yeah, just first of all, sounds really good what you guys are doing, and yeah, we are looking to do something similar up here in Queensland. My name's BJ Murphy. I'm a Girrawah man, so yeah, we're out Maleny, Woodford, Kilcoy way, for any of those who are familiar with the area. I just wanted to touch on something really quickly because I haven't heard anything about it, and understanding, Muzz, that you're down in Canberra, is there anybody on here that's had to deal with this but also have to navigate native title?
Thank you for the question. It's, I guess, where I'm focused at the moment is on privately held freehold agricultural land, as opposed to pastoral leases or other forms of crown land. Native title is extinguished on freehold, and so that's when I say that we hold all the cards. If you're on a title deed of freehold, it says in that legislation that you have the exclusive right of enjoyment. And you think of those words, somebody somewhere wrote those words and they're now enshrined in law, and they say you have the exclusive right of enjoyment of your land. I mean, it can't be anything more colonial than that. And given that, you know, we're all either 30s, 40s, 50s, and maybe even older on this call, we're just not going to be on the planet all that long. I'm 49 years old. If I'm on this farm for another 30 years, I'll be very happy. Now, 30 years in the context of an Australian landscape is a blink of an eye. And so, you know, my view on this is that people need to get their head around custodianship as opposed to ownership. I haven't answered your question directly because principally I'm dealing with and interested in sort of agricultural land, which is more in that freehold space. So I'm sorry that I didn't cover it directly.
Thanks for the question, BJ. Did you have anything you want to follow up there with?
Hi, I'm Libby. I'm a Quandamooka woman from Mulgumpa, Moreton Islands, living on Jinnabarra country with my partner BJ. That was a great answer to that question. I think also just additionally to that, I think BJ was more talking about where native title bodies are in place. So I guess just to add to that, it's about that Paul and your relationship is he's not representing a native title body, that he's representing his people, and you've built a relationship with him and his family predominantly. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, so for example, with ours, and I initially tried to make something like this happen on one of our native title blocks, and I found that within that system, we had to not only apply to the board and the family of what we were trying to do, which was initially just heal country and put a bush ducker garden in, but then also that also went above to another level of ORIC, which, you know, obviously oversees everything with the governance training and all that sort of stuff. And so I think this is a much better approach, and I do like the term that you used before about not the land ownership, but sorry, what was the term you used? The custodian and not an ownership. Yeah, it was nice to hear that, mate. Well said.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, BJ and Libby, for your questions. And Penny has popped in the chat that there's been some great examples of native title on pasture lands in South Australia. And I think that may be also related to a post that Tammi did put up earlier this week of there being a hand back in South Australia, which is really, really exciting to see. I've just got a question here in the chat from Morella. I'd like to know if you could talk a bit more about what Paul is doing with the land, or what other plans he and his family or mob have for the piece of land on country. I'm interested in understanding more the Indigenous practices, ideas or dreams that are flourishing for this slice of country that has returned to its traditional owners.
Yeah, great. Excellent question. So there are a few things that we're doing straight away, but it is a long-term play, and I'm being very respectful of Paul in terms of the space that I want to give him to allow him to think it through and to go at his own pace. So the first thing that he's doing is that he's running a cultural tour business focused on cultural artifacts, tree markings, or tree scarrings, and on-country cultural ceremony. So that experience, people can come to my farm here, and Paul can do that for them. He has a background in cultural tours, and so that's the first thing that we're doing. The second thing we're doing is we're about to start an agroforestry experiment in the creation of original timbers for traditional implements. We want to get back into the creation of traditional implements, but by using the old timbers. So we'll need to grow those. And then the third thing which we really want to focus on is we really want to get more into yam daisy, that Murnong, and we've got some plans to try and get a commercial crop of that going. But all of it from my point of view is just about facilitating him and his family to do this stuff. So there's not a dollar in it for me. It's just, you know, I've gained so much from knowing him and having him around that, you know, I can't put a price on that experience for me and for my family. So, you know, we're just working to try and help set him up and see them fly.
Thanks, Mariam. I'm conscious of the time. Do you have time for the last 2 questions? We'll take that as a yes.
Sorry, yes. Yes, sorry.
Benjamin, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Just on Ngunnawal, Ngambri land in Canberra here, and I really enjoyed the presentation, Murray. Thank you very much for sharing, and it's great to hear you speak so clearly and sort of eloquently on it as well too.
Thank you.
I can't quite figure out a delicate way to ask this question, so I'm really sorry. I apologise. It's probably going to come across as a little bit blunt. One of the things I often check in undertakings and things that I'm doing is what happens if I get hit by a bus tomorrow. Will it continue? And I get that there's some sort of, in property, there's usually estates and wills and some sort of chain of inheritance involved. But if you kind of discredit that, I guess, in terms of if everyone involved gets hit by a bus tomorrow, and I'm really sorry, I don't wish that on you or your family at all, but is there any mechanism for this continuing, or will this roll on, or will this effectively just go away if that happens? I'm really curious about the mechanisms you've got around that.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for asking the question, because these are all of the questions that need to come out. Because if people like yourself and others are going to get into this, then these are the things on your mind. We've spoken about this. We kind of see it as first base, where this is probably not the end of the road in relation to the relationship we have and the extent to which we formalise that down the track. I guess the challenge to all farmers is simply this: are you farming every single square inch of your property? And the answer, I've never spoken to a farmer who has that level of production. There is always some kind of land that's not being used. And so if you're sitting on 50 acres, that might be half an acre. If you're sitting on 220 like we are, that's about 30 acres. And if you're sitting on 5,000 acres, that could easily be 100 acres. And, you know, if you're so minded, and if council would agree to these sorts of things, then subdividing and breaking off and gifting is a goal that I think, sure, it's not for everyone, and it doesn't need to be for everyone. But one day, if I could create or facilitate a mechanism to allow that to happen, then that captures that and locks it in forever. Right now, because of the local laws, it's quite difficult to do that. But you know, we continue to work away at it. So, Ben, I'd probably just think about what we're doing as first base, and that we'll try to see what we can do down the track.
Great, thanks, Ben, for the question. Last question, so everyone can get to their dinner. From Karina. I live in Canberra, which I know to be claimed by at least 3 different First Nation groups. I understand that there's contention over this within families. I can only imagine colonisation would have caused so much pressure and pain on relationships all round. I'm wondering if you've come across much of this tension and any ways you've navigated it.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of tension. It's particularly bad in the ACT and surrounds, and that's caused principally by the former ACT governments who have elected to exclude certain parts of the traditional nations and mobs, and as a result, they have caused some pretty severe friction, which has been fueled by government money, which has been directed in some areas and not in others. It's tense. There is a group which Paul is in fact involved in, which is looking to seek to find some redress in all of this. But you know, again, it's all what we have caused. If you look at it, if you look at many of the problems, the root cause of it comes back to the systems and the apparatus that we have overlaid onto them, their culture, which has caused the dysfunction that we're now all trying to deal with. So great question. I see it and I hear about it a fair bit, and it needs fixing.
Yeah, thanks so much. Marion, I think also important to remember that the word Canberra is meeting place, and that if we essential, you know, if we reconnect with language, it helps us to understand the significance of these places well beyond, you know, white invasion. I think I'm going to wrap it there. We've gone over time, but I think we could probably keep going for much longer. So again, thank you so much to Murray for his time tonight and for sharing, you know, warts and all, the journey that you've been on. And it will be really exciting to see where it continues at Nguuruu and also beyond there. I recommend checking out Murray on Instagram. It is beautiful, especially if anyone else is stuck within their 5-kilometre radius. It's nice to have a little bit of escapism sometimes. We'll be back next month with another solidarity session, of which I can't remember what it is, but also we'll be having conversations around First Peoples and how we can continue the work of decolonising agriculture at the Convergence, which we will be advertising sort of in October time, but so stay tuned for that as well. But thank you everyone for coming tonight, and pass this on to your friends, because we all live on unceded land and we all have a journey to go on to right the wrongs of the past. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Georgie, and thank you, Murray. It's been great to have you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Good night, everybody.
Good night all. Thank you all for coming.